What's up guys, welcome to another video, and today I want to talk about your aim settings in Apex Legends. There are a lot of videos around kind of showing you different settings to use, different settings that pro players are using, and very few of those videos actually explain what all of the advanced look controls do, and even explain what any of the response curve options are actually doing in the game. So I'm going to go through all of that right now and essentially help you find the right settings for you, rather than telling you to use some setting that some pro player necessarily uses. I will show you my setting, and I'll talk about why I like the settings I have configured and give you some tips on configuring your own, but I'm not going to tell you exactly what to use. So before I get into the look settings or ALC settings or anything like that, a couple of things that I think are really helpful are the L2 and R2 button dead zone setting, for instance. So this enables you to, well, basically your gun will fire as soon as you pull down on the R2 or L2 buttons. That will actuate immediately, and that's really useful if you're using something like a Hemlock in single fire or a P2020, and you might not need that most of the time, but it is really useful when you're using those guns. And it also just means that you're going to be firing that slightly bit faster with any gun. You're going to pull the trigger a moment faster, like a millisecond faster, which might be what wins the gunfight. So another setting that I think is useful to turn off, and this is what everyone really recommends, like all pro players I see doing this, some of them are even going so far as to remove their rumble motors from their controller, and that is to turn vibration off. Vibration really doesn't communicate anything useful in Apex Legends. Like, it vibrates when you get shot, but it also vibrates when you land, when you shoot a gun, etc. So you can't distinguish the getting shot feeling from other stuff all too easily in a gunfight anyway, and you have the visual feedback on all those things too. So I really don't think you're losing anything by turning vibration off, and it doesn't benefit your aim to have your controller shaking around in your hands. So, moving on to the kind of thing that I think a lot of people are uncertain about, and that is the look sensitivity and the look sensitivity settings and response curves. So, as you can see here, you kind of have the basic look sensitivity and the ADS sensitivity, and then you have the various response curves. So, I think in order to understand what you're doing with these settings, it's actually useful to go to the advanced look controls first and talk about what each setting there is doing. So this is my ALC setup. You don't need to use this. This is what I find useful. If you fancy giving it a go, copy this configuration and I'll talk through it, and then just give it a go in training, give it a go in a few games and see if you like it. If you don't, feel free to tweak and figure out what's good for you. Anyway, yeah, I think it's really helpful for you to understand what these settings mean, so you can understand all the options you have for configuring your analog stick in Apex Legends and similar games. So, just starting off, the dead zone, that is kind of the threshold of responsiveness, like the point at which where the controller will begin to register an input when you're moving the analog stick. And the outer dead zone is kind of the end point of that responsiveness, so that the edge of your stick, where is it going to stop considering more input. So realistically, if you read the description here, it says smaller is generally better as more input allows for finer control. And there is some truth to that, but if you go too small, you'll often find yourself kind of registering small inputs that you didn't want to register in the game. And that's going to be a problem, because it means you're going to have like kind of shaky aim, like when you're pre-aiming on a doorway or something like that, when you're pre-aiming something, you're going to not quite be able to hold your aim in the right place. And the other factor is not everyone has the same kind of motor controller. I play games with a guy who has minor tremors, which means kind of his hand shakes a little bit and he has a little bit less control of his hand than someone else might do. So in that case, setting a small dead zone probably isn't the wisest idea, because it'll mean that you're taking all of those small involuntary motor movements into the game. So that's something to think about as well. The response curve. Now this is a big one that a lot of people just don't understand, from what I can tell. And the response curve essentially affects the degree of responsiveness that you get at each position on the stick. So if I turn this up to the maximum, then I'm going to have a very low degree of responsiveness at the kind of early positions on the stick, while I'm moving at a very small amount. That's not going to be very responsive. It's going to be very kind of steady to move the stick. It's going to move very slowly. So if you max it out, for instance, the first 25% of your range of motion, or perhaps more, is only going to actually move your in-game cursor, say, potentially 5 or 10%. So it kind of dullens your input responsivity. And that can be useful. Like, that can actually be useful for like long range shots, for instance, if you're wanting to be really precise and you want to have that extra control. And I think that's why Respawn have set this the kind of middle ground value, so you can get that degree of control, but it doesn't entirely dull the controller. And this is a setting that I actually like to have on its default, because I think for long range shooting, it's important to have a degree of this response curve in place so I can get that kind of careful articulation of my cursor in the game. But it's something you can play around with. A lot of really good players play with it completely off. Personally, I find that too twitchy, but it's definitely something to play around with. Yaw speed and pitch speed. So yaw speed is your horizontal movement, how quickly the camera turns left and right, and your pitch speed is your vertical movement. So the reason I have these offset, the reason they're different, is because I want my yaw speed and my pitch speed to feel as if I'm moving the camera at the same speed, even though technically I'm not. Because your vertical and horizontal field of views are different, if you have them at the same sensitivity, it's going to feel like you're moving much more quickly vertically than you are horizontally. So having them offset just enables you to kind of feel like you're moving the cursor consistently across the screen with a field of view that isn't identical from left to right and up and down. The turning extra yaw, now this is your aim acceleration. I think this is an important thing to talk about, because the problem with aim acceleration is it affects your muscle memory. Because with aim acceleration, and you can see here with the turning ramp up time and turning ramp up delay, so this affects, particularly the ramp up delay, affects how long it takes before your acceleration kicks in, and the ramp up time affects until it reaches its maximum velocity. And the problem with this is that you have to constantly kind of build this muscle memory where you're figuring out at how long do I have to hold the analog stick until it's going to reach a certain sensitivity. So it's just going to take you longer to build muscle memory with that kind of control layer, and it's just going to be more challenging because depending on how long you've held the stick, your aim is going to be different, if that makes sense. So that means if you're snapping onto a guy that's 180 degrees right behind you, basically, that's going to feel different in terms of how quickly the aim moves to snapping onto a guy that's at 90 degrees. And ideally, the guy at 180 would just be double the input of the guy at 90, right? But if you've enabled acceleration, it's not going to be that. It's going to be like less than double, and you've got to figure out that kind of fuzzy position for where you need to spin the step, for where you need to spin your aim around to snap onto this guy. So it's definitely something you can learn to get used to. I think it's definitely something you can build into your muscle memory, but it's harder. There's more for you to remember there. There's more for your muscles to remember as you're kind of controlling the analog stick. So I turn the turning extra yaw, turning extra pitch, the ramp up time and ramp up delay completely off. And the same is true with the ADS yaw speed and ADS pitch speed. These are doing the same things, but these are doing the same thing for aiming down sights. And I think it's particularly useful when you're trying to track someone with, say, 999. You want this off if possible. Like, if you can deal with having it off, then you want this to be turned off, because it just isn't helpful to have your sensitivity suddenly increasing in speed if a guy steps left for too long. For instance, say you're tracking a guy and he steps left for 3 feet, and that's enough for your increased sensitivity to suddenly kick in. You're going to find that has the potential to throw you off the target unnecessarily in comparison to when you just have it consistent like I have here. The caveat to this obviously is that if you don't have the increased turning speed, then you might find there are certain circumstances where you cannot turn fast enough. So to compensate for that, I've increased my ADS yaw speed and ADS pitch speed a little bit. And I've done the same in the just regular camera movement speed as well. So target compensation, that's your aim assist. Melee target compensation, that's your melee aim assist. I would leave these on. I've heard some people advocate turning them off and then learning to play like that, and then turning them on and you'll have like a big boost in your performance. I think you probably would have a big boost in your performance, but I don't think it's necessarily going to be better than you had before. And it's very likely that that difference is just a placebo effect because you're experiencing this big high of suddenly having target compensation on. You're going to really struggle if you turn this off. You're going to have a shit time for the entirety of the time that you turn it off. In my opinion anyway. So that is the AL3 settings. So hopefully by having a good understanding of that, we can talk about the response curves in the game so far. the kind of default ones. If you don't want to use ALC, if you don't want to get into the nitty gritty of the controls, you can use these default response curves and these default sensitivities. So classic is the default ALC profile. So classic is this response curve, and that gives you that kind of balance between fine aim and very twitchy controls. And I think that it's a fairly nice default configuration. Steady is an increased response curve, so it may be something like this. So it gives you a larger kind of period of low sensitivity at the start of your analog stick movement, which enables you to have better control over kind of steady movements in the game. So if you're using maybe something like a Hemlock or a G7, it can be useful to play on steady and track your targets a bit better over long range. I think the disadvantage to these high response curves is that when you're kind of tracking someone at close range with an R99 or any sort of close range weapon, then having that kind of delay in responsiveness early on in your stick movement isn't actually very useful. It's not very helpful. It might mean that you don't make the quick adjustment required to track a target who's just crouched or something like that, and it can make your aim a little bit harder in those close ranges. And personally, for me, it's important for my controls to be more twitchy and responsive than they are steady, and the reason for that is because those close range engagements are more important than the long range ones. So if I don't hit a guy when he's up close to me, I'm gonna die. Like, he's gonna kill me. He's gonna hit me with enough damage, and he's gonna down me instead. If I don't hit a guy that's far from me, it usually doesn't matter, right? Like, you're just poking each other, taking poke damage, trying to get an advantage on them by breaking someone's shields before you push or something like that. It doesn't make or break the gunfight. It doesn't make or break the encounter for your team to be a little bit less accurate in those fights. So I would rather focus on having a little bit harder time in those long range fights and a better time in the close range fights, if that makes sense. Yeah, and there are a few other settings here too. Like some top players play on no one plays on fine aim. Fine aim, I can't actually recall, but it makes your controls very, very twitchy. Yeah, I think that's correct. It goes between a completely dulled responsiveness and extreme twitchiness. I think that's because it probably has a maxed out response curve or something along those lines. I really don't find fine aim to be useful in a game like Apex Legends, but hey, I mean, if you give it a go and you like it, then go for it. High velocity, that's the one that's extremely twitchy all the time. This is similar to linear, but it's linear as if it had everything maxed out. I don't know why you'd play on this either, really. It makes the controls extremely twitchy. I think you're better to play on linear if you want really twitchy controls, because high velocity is just going to make the controls move at a speed that is very difficult to develop muscle memory for. And then linear, this is kind of the raw input setting. So this means there's no kind of input processing, there's no response curve, there's not going to be any increased acceleration. And it's going to be an absolute balance between your horizontal and vertical sensitivities. And I find this very difficult to control with. If you're going to use linear, I recommend adjusting the yaw and pitch speeds so that they're offset again, because I find it very unnatural to aim with absolutely perfect X and Y sensitivities. And again, it's because of the field of view vertically and horizontally being different. Like you're moving across a wider space horizontally, so unless you have that a higher value, it's going to feel like you're moving slower across that space. And that kind of feel of your controls is more important than the absolute reality of them, if that makes sense at all. So that's kind of everything you need to know in these control settings. Yeah, I recommend playing around with ALC settings, potentially. But also, if you're not comfortable with that, then classic, steady, and to a degree linear are all. One thing that is important is whatever you decide, just stick with it. You know, like play on that setting for a couple of weeks or so, and just don't try and fiddle around with things every day, because when you're developing that muscle memory to be good with any of these control configurations, it takes more than half an hour, it takes more than a day. So that means if you keep tweaking things on a daily basis or on an hourly basis, you're never going to feel like you've developed that muscle memory, and you're never going to feel like you're good with any of these layouts. You're always going to be bouncing from one to the other. You're always going to be missing shots and blaming your control settings for those misses, when in reality you just haven't acclimatized to the new control settings. So whatever you decide, just stick with it for maybe a week, at least a few days, and kind of develop that muscle memory before you decide to make any adjustments. One final thing I want to talk about, and this is the difference with ALC, and it's a benefit to ALC, is the per Optic settings. So here on the non-ALC settings, I have them set to default because I don't use the non-ALC settings. I always use ALC at the moment. But what's useful here is to turn up the sensitivities of the higher magnification scopes. And you can turn this up incrementally. You can turn this up like exponentially a lot across the group of scopes if you want. So you could be like 7 sensitivity and then insane for the higher ones if you wanted to. And that would help you kind of keep a relatively constant rate of movement across the screen regardless of which scope you're using. Personally, I don't find it useful to go that high. I find if I'm playing on insane with a Kraber, then it's too hard to aim. But I do find it useful to increase the sensitivities beyond the default to 5 or 6. So potentially something like that. And these settings are nice, but one thing to bear in mind is that the settings in the ALC options are actually better, at least in my opinion, because you can choose these settings to increase based on your default settings. So you don't have to go to that kind of next level threshold of sensitivity. You can say, oh, I'd like the 2x optic to be like a 1.2 increment. And you can change these quite a fine degree. I don't think, oh, you can get the single decimal differences, but it's actually quite fiddly on the analog stick there to do that for some reason, and it always goes up in 2s if you use the D-pad. So if you want this to be kind of like 1.3 or something like that, then expect to fiddle around with this a little bit, but you can definitely get it there. See if I can even get it back to normal at the moment. See, it's easier to go in the 2 increments of 2 because you can go to the end where it's 0.2 and then you can increase it like that. But yeah, I find this a especially helpful setting, something that helps me feel consistent across all of the scopes. Obviously, as I'm increasing in sensitivity, it's still decreasing the speed in which I move across the screen with the higher optics, but I still find it too hard to aim with a 10x optic if I've maxed this out, for instance. I find just increasing a little bit is helpful here. I might increase that a little bit right now, actually, and see how I do. But yeah, that's basically everything I want to talk about. Just play around with these settings and let me know how you find them. Hopefully, even my configuration here might help you. I think it's really good for close range tracking, which I think is the most important thing in the game right now, especially with snipers just not being very strong. So I think this is a very strong configuration for that close range tracking, which might help you in Apex Legends. Thanks very much, guys. This has been Gung Joe. Catch you in the next video.